Boring Greek myths for sleep. The one time Hera turned a guy into a peacock drifting back in time, not to the thunderous roars of battle or the heroic clashes of demigods, but to the quiet, almost forgotten corners of ancient myth. Forget the drama for a moment. Instead, let's focus on the mundane details, the logistical nightmares, and the sheer boredom of being a lesser character in a world ruled by gods. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a whisper, and the tedious business of divine deceit. Imagine, if you will, the bustling court of the gods on Mount Olympus. A place of immense power, of eternal feasting, and of endless, petty squabbles. At the center of it all is Zeus, the king, a figure of incredible might and even more incredible infidelity. His wife, Hera, is the queen, and her primary role, it often seems, is to clean up the messes left by her philandering husband. This isn't a story of grand passion. It's a story of a long-suffering wife, a perpetually unfaithful husband, and the poor, unwitting victims caught in the middle. Our first victim, an unfortunate soul named Io, was a priestess of Hera, a fact that would, in a truly cruel twist of fate, make her devotion to the queen the very source of her misery. Io was a mortal, a young woman of Argos. Her life was likely one of simple rituals and daily chores, much like any other person's. She would have prayed to the gods, maintained the temple, and lived with the quiet rhythms of her village. There was nothing particularly special about her, save for her undeniable beauty, a trait that proved to be both a blessing and an immediate, catastrophic curse. The divine gaze of Zeus, ever wandering, fell upon her. He saw her, not as a person with a life and a story, but as another conquest. To him, this was a routine affair, a brief, fleeting moment of pleasure that would be forgotten as quickly as it began. But to Io, it was a seismic event, one that would tear her from her life and transform her into something unrecognizable. Now, you have to understand the logistics of a divine affair. Zeus couldn't simply walk up to Io and woo her. His wife, Hera, possessed a preternatural sense for his transgressions. She could detect the slightest shift in the air, the faintest flicker of a new romance. Zeus, in his infinite cunning, had to be clever. He decided the best way to hide his dalliance was to wrap the entire world in a thick, dark cloud. A blanket of mist descended over the earth, a curious and unsettling phenomenon for the mortals below. They would have looked up at the sky, wondering why the sun had vanished, why the day had been plunged into an unnatural twilight. To them, it might have felt like the world was ending, but to Zeus, it was just a simple, effective concealment, a mundane bit of divine stagecraft. Hera, however, was not easily fooled. She was the goddess of marriage and family, and her divine senses were honed for detecting just this sort of mischief. She saw the cloud, this unnatural darkness, and her suspicions were immediately aroused. She knew her husband far too well. A sudden cloud, a veil of mist over the world, could only mean one thing: Zeus was up to no good again. She descended from Olympus, not with a furious roar, but with a quiet, determined resolve. She pierced the veil of cloud, looking down on the earth below, and saw them, Zeus and a beautiful mortal woman, standing in the gloom. In a panic, Zeus attempted to undo his transgression. He couldn't make Io vanish. He couldn't simply erase her from existence. His solution, in a moment of desperate brilliance and utter thoughtlessness, was to transform her. He turned the beautiful mortal woman into a pure white heifer. The transformation wasn't an act of cruelty, at least not in his mind. It was a simple, pragmatic solution to a complex problem. A heifer, a cow, was an animal of no consequence, a creature that could be easily hidden and, once the danger had passed, easily turned back. But as you can imagine, for Io, it was a terrifying, bewildering experience. One moment she was a woman, the next she was an animal, her human consciousness trapped within the bovine form. She was mute, unable to speak, to protest, or to explain her predicament. She could only stare at Zeus with her large, mournful eyes, a silent testament to his careless actions. Hera, of course, was not fooled by this last-minute disguise. She saw the new white heifer standing next to her husband and knew, instantly, who it was. The sheer audacity of his attempt to deceive her with such a flimsy disguise must have infuriated her. Instead of confronting him directly, which would have been loud and dramatic, she chose a more subtle, more insidious form of revenge. She complimented her husband on the beautiful cow and, with a perfectly calm and sweet voice, asked if she could have it as a gift. What could Zeus do? To refuse would be to admit his guilt. To give her the heifer would be to hand over his secret lover, transformed and helpless, to his vengeful wife. He was trapped. He tried to argue, to equivocate, to make excuses, but Hera was relentless. The conversation, for all its divine participants, was no more dramatic than a couple bickering over a gift. Finally, with no way out, Zeus relented. Hera, now the proud owner of a new cow, took Io into her custody. This is where the story truly takes a turn from the merely dramatic to the genuinely tedious and tragic. Hera, having Io in her possession, knew she couldn't simply leave her unattended. Io, in her heifer form, might find a way to escape or transform back. Hera needed a guardian, someone utterly and completely devoted to her cause, a being with an unblinking, unwavering vigilance. And so she chose him, Argus Panoptes. Argus, his name meaning all-seeing, was a giant with 100 eyes, scattered all over his body. Not a dramatic, heroic figure, but a grotesque, almost boringly effective one. Imagine it, 100 eyes, blinking in turns, allowing him to be perpetually awake. While some eyes slept, others remained open, ensuring that his watch was constant and absolute. Hera gave him a simple task: guard the cow. Just that. No grand quest, no heroic battle. Just the perpetual, boring, and soul-crushing task of watching a heifer graze in a field. This was Argus's job. He led Io to a remote grove and tied her to a tree, a simple, mundane act of captivity. And there she was, a princess, a priestess, now a cow, watched by a 100-eyed giant, her life reduced to the slow passage of time, the endless chewing of grass, and the silent, agonizing reality of her imprisonment. Her voice, her human form, her life, all gone, replaced by the simple, monotonous existence of a beast. This wasn't a punishment of fire and brimstone, it was a punishment of profound, soul-crushing boredom. The fate of Io was now in the hands of this unblinking sentinel. She was an object, a piece of property in a divine feud, her humanity stripped away by an act of cosmic carelessness. She was a cow, forever watched, her every move scrutinized by 100 eyes. You can only imagine the sheer monotony of her existence. The sun would rise and set, the seasons would change, and her life would remain the same, an endless loop of grazing and being watched. What could a human mind, trapped in an animal body, do but reflect on the cruel irony of her situation? She was a devotee of Hera, and it was Hera herself who had trapped her in this bovine nightmare. The real story here isn't about the grandeur of the gods. It's about the quiet desperation of a forgotten victim, the sheer tedium of a divine punishment, and the unblinking, endless watch of a 100-eyed guard. It's about the little, unglamorous details that make up the vast and often unfeeling tapestry of myth. And so, Io's new life began. As a simple cow, watched by a creature of myth who never slept. What could possibly happen to disrupt this mundane, miserable state of affairs? What hope could a cow possibly have against 100 eyes? The story of Io and Argus is not a tale of action and grand gestures, but one of stillness and the immense psychological weight of being perpetually watched. You've already been introduced to the players: Io, the transformed priestess, now a cow; Hera, the vengeful queen; and Argus, the 100-eyed sentinel, tasked with the mundane but absolute duty of keeping Io captive. In this section, we'll delve deeper into the sheer, agonizing reality of their shared, silent existence. Picture the scene again: a lush, remote pasture, verdant and peaceful on the surface. But underneath the tranquility, a profound misery festers. Io, in her bovine form, is an animal with a human mind. Her days are a monotonous cycle of grazing and standing still. She has lost her voice, her ability to communicate her plight. The only way she can express her despair is through her eyes, which, with their deep, soulful gaze, must have held an ocean of silent grief. She could see the world as she always had, but she could no longer interact with it. She was trapped in a body that was alien to her, a vessel of flesh and bone designed for a life of quiet servitude, not for a human consciousness. Her days were likely filled with a profound sense of helplessness. She would have seen the sun rise and set, the clouds drift across the sky, and the seasons change. The air might have carried the scent of wildflowers, the sound of a distant river, or the rustling of leaves in the wind, but these simple pleasures would have been a cruel mockery of her former life. She was a passive observer in her own existence, a prisoner in a pastoral setting. Her memories of being a priestess, of standing in a temple, of speaking to her fellow mortals, must have felt like a distant dream. The only reality was the cold, unyielding earth beneath her hooves and the constant, unnerving presence of Argus. And what of Argus? He wasn't a monster, at least not in the conventional sense. He was a creature of duty. His 100 eyes, scattered across his body, were a source of incredible vigilance, but they were also a source of incredible boredom. Imagine what it must be like to be perpetually awake, to have no true moment of rest. His watch was a form of eternal servitude. While some of his eyes would close, others would remain open, so that he was never truly asleep. This wasn't a thrilling watch, a lookout for an enemy. It was the slow, quiet, and profoundly uninteresting task of watching a single cow. The days would stretch into weeks, the weeks into months, and his entire existence would be reduced to the unceasing act of observation. He likely saw nothing of interest, nothing to report back to his queen. Just the slow, steady rhythm of a heifer chewing her cud. This is the beauty of this particular myth. It's not about the clash of titans or the grand adventures of heroes. It's a study in quiet, almost mundane suffering. The gods, in their immense power, often inflicted punishments that were not dramatic or explosive, but rather insidious and tedious. They understood that the mind, left to its own devices in a state of perpetual boredom and helplessness, could be its own prison. Io's punishment was not a fiery hell, but a pastoral purgatory. Argus's duty was not a glorious quest, but an endless, mind-numbing watch. But even a 100-eyed guardian has a weakness. Hera's plan, while effective, had one critical flaw: her husband. Zeus, the source of this entire mess, could not simply abandon Io. He was a powerful god, but also a figure of immense pride and, in his own way, a certain sense of responsibility for the calamities he caused. He wanted Io back, not necessarily because he loved her, but because her plight was a constant reminder of his own carelessness and his wife's victory. He couldn't simply descend and rescue her himself. That would be a direct challenge to Hera, a confrontation he was not yet ready for. So, he turned to a different kind of solution, a more subtle, more deceptive one. He sought out the cleverest of his sons, a young god known for his cunning and his ability to move between worlds, Hermes. Hermes was the god of travelers, of thieves, of merchants, and of cunning. He was the ideal choice for a task that required subterfuge and a light touch. Zeus's instructions were simple: go to the pasture, deal with Argus, and free Io. Hermes, ever the dutiful son, agreed. He descended from Olympus, not with a flourish of trumpets or a display of divine power, but in the guise of a simple shepherd. He carried with him a shepherd's staff, a cloak, and a set of panpipes, a musical instrument known for its soothing, almost hypnotic sound. He arrived at the pasture, a seemingly ordinary man wandering in search of new lands for his flock. Argus, ever vigilant, noticed him immediately. The giant's 100 eyes turned to him, 100 points of curiosity and suspicion. Hermes, however, was a master of his craft. He didn't approach Argus with a challenge or a threat. He approached him with a polite greeting and a simple, unassuming request: could he share a patch of grass for his flock? Argus, having seen nothing but a single cow for what felt like an eternity, was likely relieved to have some company. He was a guardian, not a hermit. He agreed to let Hermes stay, and so the two sat down, the god in his disguise, the giant in his unending watch. This is where the story truly becomes one of quiet, psychological warfare. Hermes did not try to overwhelm Argus with force. He began to play his panpipes. The music was not a loud, boisterous tune. It was a soft, gentle melody, a soothing lullaby that spoke of peaceful pastures and quiet streams. It was the perfect sound to lull a weary mind into a state of slumber. Hermes played on, a simple melody, a repeating tune, designed for one purpose: to put Argus to sleep. The giant, his 100 eyes weary from endless vigilance, began to succumb. One by one, an eye would close, then another, until finally, the last one drifted shut. The impossible had happened. The all-seeing guardian was asleep. Hermes had succeeded in his first task. But he couldn't simply leave Argus there, unconscious. The giant would wake up, and the whole tedious process would have to begin again. Hermes had to do something more permanent, something decisive. The next step, while seemingly simple, would change the course of a life, and a legend, forever. With all of Argus's 100 eyes closed in slumber, Hermes drew his sword. What was the quiet resolution to this tedious, mythological drama? And what became of Argus's 100 eyes after they were finally closed in sleep? The quiet resolution to the tedious standoff between the clever god and the 100-eyed giant had been reached. Hermes, the master of cunning, had lulled Argus into a complete and utter sleep with his deceptively simple music. The monotonous hum of the panpipes, a sound so perfectly suited to a mind weary of endless vigilance, had done what no force could have. It had brought the perpetual watch to a gentle, final close. With Argus in a deep slumber, all 100 of his eyes closed for the first time in what must have been an eternity, Hermes completed his task. He raised his sword and, in a swift and decisive motion, beheaded the slumbering giant. The act was not one of rage or grand heroism, but a simple, practical execution. The obstacle to Io's freedom had been removed, and the silent, boring drama of the pasture could finally come to an end. With Argus dead, the spell of captivity was broken. Io, in her bovine form, was free to roam. But her freedom was a limited one. She was still a cow, a creature of a different form, unable to speak, and completely unaware of what had just transpired. She was simply a cow with a human consciousness, wandering a world she could no longer interact with in a meaningful way. Her ordeal was not yet over. Zeus had won a small victory, but the larger, more significant problem remained: his wife. Hera, the goddess of marriage and the queen of the gods, was not a figure to be trifled with. She had been defeated, but her vengeance was only just beginning. When Hera discovered what had happened, her reaction was not one of immediate fury, but of quiet, cold calculation. She had lost her spy, her guardian, the perfect tool of her revenge. Argus had been a loyal servant, and his death was a profound insult. But Hera was a goddess of profound emotional depth, and she was not one to let a useful thing go to waste. She understood that even in death, Argus's legacy could serve her. In a powerful, but strangely beautiful, act of transfiguration, she took the 100 eyes of the slain Argus. She gathered them, not as gruesome trophies, but as something precious, something she could preserve and honor. The eyes of Argus, now detached from his body, were still vibrant and full of their uncanny light. Hera took these 100 luminous orbs and placed them onto the tail of her sacred animal, the peacock. The creature, already a symbol of regal beauty and pride, was now transformed. The plain, iridescent tail feathers of the peacock were now adorned with 100 brilliant, all-seeing eyes. The peacock's tail, a symbol of divine splendor, became a permanent memorial to Argus and a constant, visual reminder of Hera's unwavering vigilance and the price of her husband's infidelity. The peacock, with its fan of eyes, would forever serve as a living monument to the tragedy and the vengeance of the gods. For Io, the story continued, though her time in our narrative is drawing to a close. With Argus gone, Hera's next form of punishment was a relentless and maddening gadfly. The insect, sent by the goddess, followed Io relentlessly, stinging her and driving her to a state of perpetual madness. Io, the once calm priestess, was now a frantic cow, running across the world, unable to find rest. She crossed continents, swam across seas, and fled through mountains, all while the maddening sting of the gadfly pursued her. The Ionian Sea, for example, is said to have been named after her, a testament to her endless, panicked flight. She finally reached Egypt, a land of ancient gods and different powers, and there, at last, Zeus found her and restored her to her human form. She was finally freed, but her journey had left an indelible mark on her. The quiet, almost boring elements of this myth hold the deepest lessons. It's not the clash of wills between Zeus and Hera that is most significant, it is the quiet, unsung tragedy of the victims caught in the middle. Io, a woman of simple faith, was transformed into an animal and subjected to a slow, profound misery, all for the fleeting pleasure of a god. Her story is one of profound resilience, a quiet endurance of the unimaginable. She survived her transformation, her captivity, and her maddening flight, only to be returned to a world that was now completely different. Her past was erased, her identity changed, and her sanity tested by the whimsical cruelty of the gods. And Argus? He was not a hero. He was a dutiful servant, a creature of endless vigilance who was defeated not by strength, but by a simple, soothing melody. His death was a quiet one, a footnote in a larger story, but his eyes became a permanent, and very visible, part of the mythological landscape. The peacock, a bird we associate with beauty and grandeur, carries on its tail the unblinking watch of a forgotten guardian. It's a silent reminder that even the most boring, most dutiful of lives can become a part of something larger, a piece of a grand design that we can still see today. This is the real truth of the myths. They are not just stories of gods and monsters, but of the mundane, forgotten lives that were swept up in their endless dramas. They are a testament to human resilience in the face of forces far beyond our control. Io's survival wasn't a triumph of strength, but a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. And Argus's legacy wasn't one of glory, but of eternal vigilance, a quiet, almost boring, reminder of the price of divine intervention. The next time you see a peacock, remember the quiet, all-seeing eyes on its tail, and the silent, tedious tragedy they represent. The past isn't made up of just heroes and villains, it's also made up of the forgotten, the resilient, and the boring details that shape the world. Let's turn the page from the divine squabbles of Olympus and descend to the mundane, dusty streets of ancient Athens. We're not here to witness a great battle or a mythical quest. Instead, we're going to focus on a man of quiet genius, a craftsman whose life was defined not by heroism, but by the meticulous, boring details of his trade. His name was Daedalus, and he was, by all accounts, the greatest inventor of his time. But before the great myths and the tragic flight, his life was one of humble apprenticeship, rivalries, and the slow, deliberate work of a genius. Daedalus was a master craftsman, a man whose hands could bring wood and metal to life. He was a descendant of the royal house of Athens, a fact that gave him a certain social standing but did little to separate him from the daily grind of his work. His reputation was built on his skill. He was a sculptor who could make statues so lifelike they seemed to breathe, and an architect whose buildings were both beautiful and incredibly functional. He was the kind of person you would turn to for a complicated problem, a man who would solve it not with magic, but with geometry, physics, and a deep understanding of materials. His workshop would have been a place of quiet industry. You would have heard the rhythmic tap of a hammer, the soft rasp of a file on stone, and the low, murmuring sound of Daedalus teaching his apprentices. He was a man of his city, respected and admired, and he had a young pupil, his nephew Talos, or Perdix, who showed a remarkable aptitude for invention. Talos was a genius in his own right, perhaps even more naturally gifted than his mentor. He invented the saw, inspired, so the story goes, by the jagged spine of a fish. He also invented the potter's wheel, another invention that would revolutionize daily life but would go largely uncredited in the grand annals of myth. Talos' success was not a cause for celebration for Daedalus. Instead, it was a source of profound, and ultimately fatal, jealousy. This is where the story shifts from the mundane to the tragic, not with a bang, but with a whisper of professional rivalry. Daedalus, despite his own immense talent, saw his nephew's inventions as a threat to his reputation. The young man was not just a student, he was a rival, and a formidable one at that. Daedalus's quiet life, so full of steady work and a rising reputation, was suddenly overshadowed by the bright, unbridled genius of his protégé. The details of what happened next are a little blurry, a testament to the fact that even in myth, people try to hide their sins. But what is certain is that Daedalus, in a fit of rage or a moment of calculated cruelty, led his nephew to the top of the Acropolis and pushed him off. Talos fell to his death, a quiet end to a promising life, and a dark stain on the character of Athens' greatest inventor. Daedalus's act was not one of epic betrayal, but of petty, professional jealousy. It's a story we still see today, the mentor who can't stand to be surpassed by the student. But in ancient Athens, the consequences were very real. Daedalus was put on trial for murder. The court of the Areopagus, a council of elders who served as judges, found him guilty. His punishment was not death, but exile. He was forced to leave Athens, the city he had built and adorned with his works, and wander the world in search of a new home. This wasn't a glorious departure, it was a humiliating and lonely one. He was a fugitive, a disgraced craftsman, and a man haunted by the ghost of his own ambition. His journey took him to the island of Crete, a bustling and powerful kingdom ruled by King Minos. Minos was a cunning and ambitious king who had a knack for spotting talent, and he knew of Daedalus's reputation. He welcomed the exiled inventor, not as a hero, but as a valuable asset. To King Minos, Daedalus was a tool, a brilliant mind he could use to his own advantage. Daedalus, in turn, was a man in need of work and a new beginning. He agreed to serve the king, to put his genius to use for the very man who would ultimately become his captor. This new life on Crete was one of immense creativity but also of immense isolation. Daedalus was a guest, a highly valued one, but he was not truly free. He was an artist, but his art was now in service of a master who was both appreciative and demanding. King Minos commissioned Daedalus for a number of projects, each more intricate than the last. But one of these commissions was different. It was born out of a terrible secret, a divine punishment that would require all of Daedalus's skills to contain. The king's wife, Pasiphae, had been cursed by the sea god Poseidon to fall in love with a bull. The result of this unnatural union was the Minotaur, a monstrous creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. The Minotaur was a terrible secret, a shameful mark on the royal family, and King Minos needed a way to hide it from the world. He turned to his master craftsman, the exiled Daedalus, with a simple, yet impossibly complex, request: build a prison from which there could be no escape. The prison was to be a maze so intricate, so confusing, that even the man who built it would struggle to find his way out. This was not a work of art, but a work of necessity, a monument to a king's shame. Daedalus accepted the commission, and he began to design the most complex building of his career. He wasn't building a temple or a sculpture, he was building a trap. The details of this construction were boringly technical, the geometry of the twisting hallways, the subtle slopes that would confuse a person's sense of direction, the dead ends and false turns. It was a project of pure, mind-numbing logic. And so, Daedalus began to build the labyrinth, a work of quiet, mathematical genius that would define his life forever. The project was long and tedious, a testament to the sheer boredom of complex construction. But as he built this prison, what was he truly constructing for himself? What thoughts must have haunted him as he worked, alone, on a project with such a terrible purpose? What was the final, defining feature of the labyrinth that made it so inescapable? And what did Daedalus, the architect of this monstrous prison, learn about himself in the process? The construction of the labyrinth was a project of pure, mind-numbing logic, a testament to the immense patience and technical skill of Daedalus. You've been introduced to the tragic origin of the structure, a monument to King Minos's shame, built to contain the monstrous Minotaur. Now, let's delve into the actual, boring details of its construction, the very elements that made it so terrifyingly effective. This was not a building filled with traps or mythical beasts, its danger lay in its design. It was a prison built from confusion itself. Daedalus, the master craftsman, worked with an almost obsessive attention to detail. He didn't just create a maze, he created a system of disorientation. He understood the fundamental principles of human navigation and deliberately undermined them. He built the labyrinth not on a flat, even plane, but with subtle, almost imperceptible slopes. A person walking through its corridors would feel they were on level ground, but over time, these small inclines would lead them in circles, subtly confusing their sense of direction. The walls were not just walls, they were curved in such a way that no two corridors looked exactly alike, yet they were not distinct enough to be memorable. Every corner, every turn, seemed both familiar and utterly alien. The sheer scale of the project was daunting. We are talking about thousands of feet of winding corridors, of dead ends that looked like promising new paths, and of junctions where every choice seemed equally wrong. Daedalus was not just an architect, he was a psychologist, preying on the very human need to make sense of one's surroundings. The labyrinth was a physical manifestation of chaos, a place where a person's own mind would become their greatest enemy. The Minotaur was the ultimate, horrifying punchline to this grand, tedious joke. The monster didn't need to hunt for its victims. It simply waited for them to become lost, disoriented, and utterly hopeless. As Daedalus worked, he must have been a profoundly lonely man. He was the only person on the island who knew the true nature of his work. He was building a prison for a creature, but he was also building a prison for himself. King Minos, for all his appreciation of Daedalus's genius, was a king, and a paranoid one at that. He knew that the only person who could reveal the secret of the labyrinth was the man who built it. As a result, Daedalus and his young son, Icarus, who had accompanied him to Crete, were kept under what amounted to house arrest. They were given a workshop, materials, and a life of comfort, but they were not free to leave. Daedalus was not a prisoner of a cell, but a prisoner of his own creation. His genius had been his downfall. The tedium of this existence must have been immense. Day after day, he would work on commissions for the king, knowing that his every act of creation only tightened the chains of his confinement. He was a bird in a gilded cage, his hands constantly busy, his mind constantly plotting. His thoughts, however, were not of escape by force or divine intervention. They were of a more subtle, more ingenious nature, just like the mind that had built the labyrinth itself. He knew that any traditional escape route would be monitored. The seas were watched by King Minos's navy, and the land was patrolled by his guards. He had to think of a way out that was entirely unforeseen, a solution that lay outside the traditional boundaries of a king's control. He looked to the sky. He looked at the birds soaring effortlessly over the walls of the palace, over the ships in the harbor, and over the vast, open sea that separated Crete from the rest of the world. He began to study them, not with a sense of wonder, but with a craftsman's eye. He paid attention to the physics of their flight, the subtle curves of their wings, and the way the feathers provided lift and direction. The idea that began to form in his mind was not a mythic one, but a practical one. It was a project born of pure observation and scientific principles. Daedalus began to gather materials. Not wood or stone, but feathers. He would collect them meticulously, one by one, from the vast flocks of birds that nested in the cliffs around the palace. He would study their size, their shape, and their resilience. He also began to work with wax, a material that was common and easy to melt and mold. He had a plan that was both audacious and incredibly simple in its mechanics. He would build wings. Not wings of magic, but wings of pure engineering. He would create a pair for himself and a smaller, more delicate pair for his son, Icarus. This was a long, painstaking process. This wasn't a quick fix or a moment of divine inspiration. This was a tedious, repetitive, and deeply personal project. Day after day, he would meticulously arrange feathers, securing them with twine and wax, building a contraption that, to any other person, would have seemed utterly insane. He was a man with a singular purpose, to reclaim his freedom, not with a sword, but with a pair of wings. As he worked, his son Icarus would watch him with a child's curiosity, unaware of the immense danger and the profound lesson that was being built piece by painstaking piece. Daedalus was not just building wings, he was building a dream, a hope for a new life, and a quiet, almost boring, escape. But what did Daedalus, in his wisdom and his meticulous attention to detail, fail to consider? What crucial, unexciting detail, about the materials themselves, would prove to be the most dangerous part of his grand design? The quiet, painstaking work was finally complete. Daedalus had constructed 2 pairs of wings, one for himself and a smaller, more delicate set for his son, Icarus. The wings were not things of magic, they were a triumph of tedious, repetitive engineering. He had arranged countless feathers, meticulously bound with linen thread, and sealed with wax. The entire project was a testament to his craftsmanship, a mundane, unheroic preparation for an utterly audacious plan. This was not a flight of fancy, but a calculated escape, a gamble based on a single, crucial element, the properties of wax. As he prepared for their flight, Daedalus gave his son a set of instructions. And here, in these simple, boring details, lies the true heart of the tragedy. He didn't tell Icarus about the monstrous Minotaur or the treachery of the king. He spoke to him as a craftsman to an apprentice, a father to a son. His instructions were rooted in the cold, unyielding laws of physics. "My son," he said, "I have built these wings, not for you to soar among the gods, but to escape our prison. We must fly a middle course. If you fly too low, the sea spray will weigh down the feathers, and you will fall. If you fly too high, the sun's heat will melt the wax, and you will fall." This was not a tale of divine intervention or cosmic retribution. It was a story about the unglamorous, inescapable consequences of ignoring basic physical limitations. Daedalus understood this implicitly. He was an inventor, a man who worked with the properties of materials. He knew the melting point of wax and the density of water. His warning was not a prophecy, it was a simple, pragmatic statement of fact. To ignore it would be to defy the very laws that made their escape possible. The 2 of them launched into the air, a sight that must have been both terrifying and exhilarating. They were the first humans to fly, their escape not a grand spectacle, but a quiet, almost unobserved departure. From the ground, they might have looked like strange, large birds. Daedalus, with the wisdom of a seasoned craftsman, flew a steady, middle course, his mind focused on the technicalities of their flight. He felt the air currents, adjusted the angle of his wings, and kept a careful eye on his son. He was a man of logic, and his flight was an exercise in pure, calculated survival. Icarus, however, was a child. He felt the exhilaration of the flight, the incredible sensation of soaring through the open air, a feeling no mortal had ever experienced before. He saw the world below shrinking, the trees and houses turning into specks. His father's warnings, the dull, technical details about melting wax and sea spray, faded into the background. His heart was filled with a sense of pure, unbridled freedom, a feeling that made him forget the very limitations that made his freedom possible. He began to ascend, higher and higher, a small figure of human hubris reaching for the sun. The tragedy of Icarus is not a lesson about flying too close to the sun in a mythological sense. It's a lesson about the mundane, unglamorous consequences of youthful recklessness. The sun, in its unrelenting heat, did exactly what a craftsman would expect it to do. It heated the wax. The wax, in its quiet, boring nature, did exactly what it was designed to do when heated: it melted. The feathers, no longer secured, began to fall away, one by one. Icarus felt the disintegration of his wings, not as a sudden, cataclysmic event, but as a slow, creeping loss of lift. The feathers would have fluttered down around him, a silent rain of warning that he could not heed. His flight turned into a frantic, hopeless plummet. His screams would have been lost to the wind as he plunged into the sea below. Daedalus, a man of logic and reason, was powerless to stop the descent. He could only watch as his son, his apprentice, and the product of his greatest invention fell to his death. His flight was a success, but it was a hollow one. He landed safely in a place that would later be named Icaria, in his son's honor. He was finally free, but his freedom was marked by an immense, soul-crushing loss. He would go on to be a famous inventor, a man of incredible skill, but his greatest creation was also his greatest sorrow. The story of Daedalus and Icarus is not a story of gods and monsters, but of a quiet, brilliant man and his tragic, predictable failure. It is a lesson about the importance of knowing your materials, understanding your limitations, and heeding the boring, but essential, warnings of those who came before you. Daedalus's genius was not in building a maze or a pair of wings, but in understanding the simple physics that governed his world. Icarus's tragedy was in his decision to ignore them. The myth is not about a hero who fell from the sky, but about a young man who failed to understand the mundane details of his own survival. It's a quiet, sobering reminder that even in a world of magic and myth, the laws of nature are still the most powerful forces of all. The sea still rises, the sun still burns, and wax still melts. You might think of the Trojan War as a grand, epic struggle, a clash of heroes and gods, but for the average soldier, it was an endless, grinding chore. The Trojan War was not a quick, glorious conflict, it was a 10-year siege. 10 years of boredom, of routine, of watching the same city walls from the same dusty camp. For men like Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, the end of the war was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of profound, tedious exhaustion. He had spent a decade away from his kingdom, his wife, and his young son. All he wanted was to go home. Odysseus was not your typical hero. He was a man of cunning, a master of words, and a figure of immense patience. While other heroes like Achilles were defined by their strength and rage, Odysseus was defined by his wit and his ability to endure. He was the architect of the Trojan horse, a brilliant, deceptively simple plan that finally brought the long, boring war to a close. But his genius for strategy on the battlefield did not translate into a smooth journey home. In fact, his return journey, known as the Odyssey, was less of a heroic quest and more of a series of logistical and navigational nightmares. The journey began with what should have been a simple voyage from Troy to Greece. But Odysseus, ever the man of action, made a crucial mistake almost immediately. He and his men stopped at the land of the Cyclades, a coastal city known for its riches. They raided the city, stole its wealth, and celebrated their victory with a feast. This was a common practice for returning soldiers, a bit of plunder to make up for 10 years of sacrifice. But their celebratory brawling was their undoing. The Cyclades rallied their neighbors and launched a counterattack. Odysseus and his men, now drunk and disorganized, were caught off guard. They fought bravely, but they suffered heavy losses and were forced to flee back to their ships. The first leg of their journey home was a costly, humiliating failure, a simple example of how a moment of carelessness can have lasting consequences. From there, their troubles truly began. The wind, which should have carried them swiftly back to Greece, turned against them. They were blown off course, not by a great storm, but by a steady, persistent gale. They were lost at sea, adrift in a world they no longer recognized. Their first major stop, after many days of aimless sailing, was the land of the Lotus Eaters. This was not a place of great danger, but of profound, insidious temptation. The Lotus Eaters were a gentle people who offered Odysseus's men a fruit that tasted sweet but caused them to forget their homes, their families, and their purpose. It was a kind of drug, a narcotic that replaced the longing for home with a sense of blissful, apathetic contentment. When Odysseus sent a few of his men to scout the land, they ate the lotus and immediately fell under its spell. They no longer wanted to leave. They simply wanted to stay in this peaceful, forgetful state forever. This was not a battle to be won with a sword, but a battle against the human desire for escape from responsibility. Odysseus, in a rare moment of direct action, had to physically drag his men back to the ship and tie them to their benches. He forced them to leave this land of quiet temptation, to sail back into the uncertainty of their journey. It was a mundane, unheroic act, but it was an act of a leader who understood that a life of quiet inaction was a fate worse than any storm or monster. Their journey continued, and their next destination was even more peculiar. They sailed to the land of the Cyclopes, a race of one-eyed giants. Odysseus and his men were starving and thirsty, and they saw a cave filled with cheese, milk, and sheep. They went inside, thinking they had found a place of refuge. But the owner of the cave was the Cyclops Polyphemus, a brutish, monstrous shepherd who had no respect for the laws of hospitality. He sealed the cave entrance with a massive boulder, trapping Odysseus and his men inside. This was not a quick, dramatic confrontation. It was a prolonged, terrifying ordeal. Polyphemus ate 2 of Odysseus's men every day for 2 days, a slow, methodical consumption that must have been agonizing for the survivors. Odysseus, however, was a man of cunning. He knew he couldn't defeat the giant with strength alone. He had to use his mind. He waited until Polyphemus was drunk on the wine he had offered him. He then sharpened a massive olive stake and, with the help of his men, drove it into the giant's single eye, blinding him. But even this was a logistical problem. How would they escape the cave? The boulder still blocked the entrance, and the blind Cyclops would surely be waiting for them. What was the clever, unglamorous solution that allowed Odysseus and his men to escape the cave? And what was the single act of hubris that turned a successful escape into a cosmic curse? The blinding of the Cyclops Polyphemus was a moment of cunning genius, but it was only the first part of a larger, more tedious problem: how to escape from a cave sealed by a giant boulder, with a blind, enraged giant waiting on the other side. Odysseus, ever the master of mundane details, had a plan. He knew that Polyphemus would have to move the boulder to let his sheep out to graze. He also knew that the giant was blind, but not stupid. Polyphemus would likely stand at the entrance and feel the backs of his sheep as they passed, ensuring no one was riding them. Odysseus's solution was both simple and ingenious. He and his men, in a quiet, unheroic act, strapped themselves to the undersides of the giant's sheep. When Polyphemus moved the boulder and let his flock out, he felt the backs of the sheep, as expected, but he never thought to check underneath them. He was a creature of immense strength, but a victim of his own unimaginative mind. And so, in a quiet, unglamorous fashion, Odysseus and his men escaped, clinging to the bellies of sheep, their lives hanging on the unthinking movements of a flock. This was a moment of triumph, a testament to Odysseus's ability to think his way out of a problem. But it was also a moment of immense, self-destructive pride. As they sailed away, a safe distance from the shore, Odysseus could not resist the urge to taunt the blind giant. He shouted back to the cave, revealing his true name: "If any man asks who put out your eye, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." This was a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris. For a man who had been so careful and so clever, this single act of pride was a catastrophic mistake. Polyphemus, now knowing the identity of the man who had wronged him, called upon his father, Poseidon, the god of the sea. Poseidon, a powerful and vindictive deity, was already a bit annoyed with Odysseus due to some minor past slights, but this was a direct appeal for vengeance. The Cyclops' curse was simple and powerful: may Odysseus never reach his home, or if he does, may he arrive alone, after many years of hardship, with his ship destroyed and his men dead. This was the moment when a series of unfortunate events became a divine curse, a tedious journey became a cosmic punishment. The curse of Poseidon was not a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, persistent campaign of divine sabotage. The seas, which were once his allies, now became his greatest enemy. Storms would rise out of nowhere, winds would change direction without warning, and the very currents would conspire against him. The journey home, which should have taken a few weeks, now stretched into a decade. Their next stop was the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. Aeolus, a kind and hospitable figure, took pity on Odysseus and his men. He gave Odysseus a powerful gift, a bag containing all the storm winds, tied with a silver cord. He kept the gentle, favorable wind, the one that would carry them straight to Ithaca, free. This was a gift of immense power, a solution to all of their navigational problems. All they had to do was keep the bag closed and sail home. They sailed for 9 days, with Ithaca finally in sight, a sight that must have brought tears to their eyes after so many years of wandering. They could see the smoke rising from the chimneys, the familiar coastline. But Odysseus, exhausted from the long watch, fell asleep. His men, who had been through so much and were now so close to home, became suspicious. They reasoned that the bag of winds must contain gold or some other treasure, and that their captain was hoarding it for himself. In a moment of greed and short-sightedness, they untied the silver cord. The storm winds, all of them at once, burst out of the bag with a terrible roar. The ship was immediately blown back, a violent, chaotic reversal that sent them flying back out to sea, away from their home, away from all their hopes and dreams. They had been so close, and now, they were lost again, a victim of their own impatience and their captain's unglamorous exhaustion. When they finally managed to return to Aeolia, Odysseus, in a moment of profound humility, begged Aeolus for help again. But the keeper of the winds saw what had happened. He knew that Odysseus was cursed, and that his journey was under the active persecution of the gods. He refused to help, stating that a man so hated by the immortals was beyond his aid. And so, with no hope of a favorable wind, Odysseus and his men were forced to row, a soul-crushing, physically exhausting task, a slow, tedious crawl back into the unknown. Their journey had now become a series of almost winds and devastating setbacks, a mundane cycle of hope and despair. They were not fighting monsters every day, they were fighting exhaustion, frustration, and the psychological weight of a curse that seemed to follow them everywhere. This was the real Odyssey, not a glorious quest, but a slow, grinding ordeal, a testament to the sheer, boring misery of a long and difficult journey. What was the most profound and terrifying trial Odysseus faced, and how did his cunning and his ability to endure mundane details save him from it? After the devastating setback with the bag of winds, the crew of Odysseus was a demoralized and exhausted lot. Their journey was no longer a heroic quest, it was a desperate struggle for survival against a universe that seemed actively hostile to their return. They had lost the winds, and now they were rowing their way through an unknown sea, their bodies aching and their spirits flagging. This was the true nature of their ordeal, not a series of epic battles, but a slow, grinding attrition. Their next stop, however, brought them face to face with a profoundly different kind of danger. They landed on the island of Circe, a powerful and beautiful enchantress. She was not a monster in the physical sense, but her magic was more insidious than any brute force. She invited Odysseus's men into her home, fed them a feast, and offered them a potent brew. The brew, however, was laced with a spell that turned them into swine. The men, who had endured years of war and hardship, were reduced to grunting, snorting animals, their human minds trapped within the bodies of pigs. Odysseus, who had been separated from his men, learned of their fate. He knew he could not confront Circe with force. She was a goddess, and he was a mortal, albeit a clever one. He had to rely on a different kind of power. He was met by Hermes, the messenger god, who took pity on him. Hermes gave him a magical herb called moly, which would protect him from Circe's spell. The instructions were simple and precise: eat the herb, go to her house, and when she offers you the potion, drink it without fear. When she attempts to use her magic, draw your sword and threaten her. This was a moment of immense courage, but also immense trust. Odysseus had to believe in the word of a god and the power of a simple herb. He did as he was told. He confronted Circe, drank her potion, and when she tried to turn him into a pig, nothing happened. Circe was shocked. No mortal had ever resisted her magic before. Her power had been rendered useless by a mundane botanical. Odysseus then drew his sword and forced her to release his men. The episode with Circe was not just about overcoming a sorceress. It was about the power of endurance and the importance of heeding good advice. Odysseus did not win by brute force, but by trusting in a plan, by relying on a simple tool, and by having the patience to see it through. He and his men ended up staying with Circe for a year, recuperating and regaining their strength. This was not a moment of inaction, but of necessary rest, a quiet pause in their long journey home. It was a testament to the fact that even in a world of monsters and gods, the most important thing a person can do is take care of themselves. But their journey was not over. Circe told Odysseus that to get home, he must first travel to the underworld and consult the blind prophet Tiresias. This was a terrifying, profoundly unheroic task. He had to face his own mortality, to descend into the realm of the dead, to seek advice from a ghost. This was not a fight, it was a journey of the mind. He had to find his way to the edge of the world, perform a ritual, and call upon the spirits of the dead. He spoke to his mother, to fallen comrades from the Trojan War, and finally, to Tiresias. The prophet's message was a grim one: his journey would continue to be long and difficult, and his return home would be full of more trials. But if he had the patience, the resilience, and the cunning, he would one day see his family again. This moment in the underworld was not a dramatic climax, but a quiet, somber reaffirmation of his purpose. The hero's journey was not about defeating a single enemy, it was about surviving an endless series of small, grinding challenges. Odysseus faced many more trials on his way home: the songs of the sirens, which he and his men overcame by plugging their ears with wax and having him tied to the mast, the two-headed monster Scylla and the whirlpool Charybdis, which he navigated with a clever, but costly, sacrifice of 6 of his men, and the island of the sun god Helios, where his crew, in a moment of desperate hunger, ate the sacred cattle, a transgression that led to their final, devastating shipwreck. Odysseus was the sole survivor. He finally washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso. Calypso, who was also a goddess, fell in love with him and offered him immortality if he would stay with her forever. She offered him an end to his journey, an eternal life of comfort and peace. This was his final, most profound test. It was not a physical challenge, but a test of will. He had to choose between a life of ease and a life of profound hardship, between immortality and the fleeting, precious reality of his family and his home. And in a moment of quiet, unromantic longing, he chose home. He chose mortality. He chose the slow, difficult path of a man who simply wanted to be with his family again. His journey home was a testament to the power of a single, simple, and unglamorous virtue: endurance. The story of the Odyssey is not about a hero who wins every battle. It is about a man who survives every defeat, who learns from every mistake, and who, no matter how tired he is, keeps moving forward. His journey was a long, boring, and often humiliating one. But it was also a testament to the fact that true heroism is not found in the strength of your sword, but in the patience of your spirit. His final, unglamorous arrival home, disguised as a beggar, was the quietest and most meaningful moment of all. He was not a hero returning to a cheering crowd. He was a man returning to his family, a survivor of a long, boring war and an even longer, more boring journey. We've all heard the myth of the Trojan horse, a giant wooden horse, a clever ruse, and the dramatic fall of an impenetrable city. But what happened after the horse was wheeled inside the city walls? The story often ends with the triumphant Greeks emerging from the horse, a moment of dramatic suspense and victory. But for the people of Troy, and for the victorious Greeks, the night was not one of loud, triumphant celebration. It was a night of quiet, brutal, and profoundly unglamorous chaos. It was a night of logistical nightmares, of silent butchery, and of a city's slow, agonizing collapse. For 10 long, boring years, the Greeks had laid siege to the city of Troy. The siege itself was a monotonous, soul-crushing experience. The men had grown weary, their supplies were running low, and their resolve was at its breaking point. For the Trojans, life had become a matter of quiet endurance, of rationing food, and of living with the constant threat of attack. The city walls, which had protected them for a decade, were a source of both security and profound confinement. The Trojan horse, from their perspective, was not a symbol of their impending doom, but a sign of a boring, protracted conflict finally coming to an end. They believed it was an offering to the gods, a gift that would bring them peace and finally, an end to the siege. The first logistical problem of the horse was getting it inside the city. The Trojans had to tear down a part of their own city wall, a monumental and unglamorous task, to bring the immense wooden structure through. This was an act of both trust and immense labor. It was a tedious, backbreaking process that took a significant amount of time and effort. As the men worked, they were not just pulling a horse, they were dismantling their own defenses, piece by painstakingly dull piece. This was the moment of their undoing, not by an enemy, but by their own hand. Once the horse was inside the city, the celebrations began. But this was not a joyous, free-for-all party. This was a celebration born of 10 years of pent-up exhaustion and fear. The Trojans were drinking, singing, and feasting, but the mood must have been tinged with a sense of quiet disbelief. They had survived a decade of war, and now, it was finally over. The feeling was likely one of profound relief, a quiet exhale after a long, difficult breath. The noise of their celebration, however, was a cover for a far more sinister and quiet operation. Inside the horse, the Greeks were not heroes preparing for a glorious battle. They were a small, cramped group of men, packed into a dark, stuffy, and uncomfortable space. They had to sit in absolute silence for hours, listening to the sounds of the Trojan celebration. They were not a triumphant army, but a group of men in a wooden box, their fate dependent on the sheer luck of not being discovered. The boredom of their wait must have been immense. Every creak of the wood, every distant sound of laughter, must have been a source of immense anxiety. The waiting was the hardest part, a mundane psychological ordeal that required an incredible amount of discipline. As the Trojan celebrations died down and the city fell into a deep, drunken sleep, the Greek soldiers began their quiet, unglamorous work. The leader of the group, a man named Hippias who was also the builder of the horse, carefully opened a hidden door in the horse's belly. The soldiers, one by one, slid down a rope to the ground. This was not a moment of dramatic descent. It was a slow, deliberate, and quiet operation. They had to be careful not to make a sound, not to alert the sleeping city. The men who emerged were not a full army. They were a small, surgical team, a group of quiet assassins with a single, unheroic task: open the city gates. While the main Greek army waited outside, their fate was in the hands of these few men. They moved through the dark, silent streets of Troy, their feet making no sound, their movements precise and practiced. They were not warriors in a grand battle, they were a quiet, unglamorous special forces unit, their mission a matter of simple, brutal efficiency. They found the city gates, and their task was simple: unbar them. This was a quiet, almost boring action, but it was the single most important moment of the entire war. The gates, once the symbol of Troy's strength, were now the instrument of its demise. With the gates open, the full Greek army, which had been waiting in the shadows, streamed into the city. The ensuing battle was not a glorious fight on an open field. It was a brutal, one-sided slaughter. The Trojans were caught completely off guard, drunk, and unarmed. The Greeks, fueled by 10 years of pent-up rage and exhaustion, were merciless. The true horror of the fall of Troy wasn't the horse, it was the silent, almost unobserved butchery that followed. The city, which had endured for a decade, collapsed in a single, brutal night. What was the fate of the royal family, who had been at the heart of the city's defense? And what was the quiet, unspoken cost of a victory that was won not with honor, but with deceit? The fall of Troy was not a glorious battle, it was a massacre. The Greeks, after a decade of frustration and suffering, were fueled by a brutal rage that swept through the city's streets. The Trojan royal family, who had been at the heart of the city's endurance, met a series of quiet, unheroic fates. This was not a story of noble sacrifice, but of a family being systematically, and often shamefully, dismantled by the victors. The first and most prominent casualty was King Priam. The old king, the patriarch who had watched his city endure for 10 long years, fled to the altar of Zeus, a sacred place he hoped would offer him sanctuary. But even the gods could not protect him from the sheer brutality of the Greeks. He was killed by Neoptolemus, the son of the great Achilles. This was not a fight between equals. It was the murder of an old man, a final, inglorious end to a life of immense authority and sorrow. His death, at the foot of an altar, was a stark symbol of the complete and utter collapse of Trojan power and the desecration of everything they held sacred. His wife, Hecuba, the queen of Troy, was an even more tragic figure. She had been a mother to many, and a queen to all, and she had watched her sons, her daughters, and her city fall around her. Her fate was not a quick death, but a long, slow process of humiliation and despair. She was taken as a prize of war by Odysseus, the very man whose cunning had led to her city's demise. Her future was one of slavery and servitude, a living embodiment of the Trojan defeat. But the most horrifying part of her story was the final, unheroic indignity. She was later said to have been transformed into a dog, a creature of low regard, forever to be hounded and tormented by her memories. The women of the royal family were particularly vulnerable to the whims of their captors. Cassandra, the prophetic priestess who had warned the Trojans about the horse, was now a figure of profound pity. Her warnings had been ignored, a curse placed upon her by the god Apollo that meant no one would ever believe her prophecies. She had been right, but her correctness had led to her city's destruction. In the chaos of the sack, she was dragged from the temple of Athena and given to King Agamemnon as a concubine. She would later be killed by Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, upon their return to Greece, a quiet end to a life of unbearable, unheeded foresight. Another woman who suffered a quiet, painful fate was Andromache, the wife of the great Trojan hero, Hector. She had lost her husband, her city, and now, her child. The Greeks, in a moment of cold, unglamorous cruelty, decided to kill her young son, Astyanax, to prevent him from ever growing up to seek revenge for his city. The child, a symbol of hope for the future of Troy, was thrown from the city walls, a final, brutal act of destruction. Andromache was then taken as a slave by Neoptolemus, the same man who had killed her husband and her father-in-law. Her life, which had once been one of great status and love, was now one of servitude and profound, unending grief. The fall of Troy was not just a military victory, it was a cultural and familial obliteration. The Trojans were a people without a future. Their king was dead, their queen was a slave, their children were murdered, and their women were given as prizes of war. The great, impenetrable city was now a smoldering ruin, a testament to the fact that even the most well-fortified city could not withstand a simple, boring act of deceit. But amidst the total destruction, there was a single, quiet exception, a man who, through his pious and undramatic actions, would become the unlikely father of a new, great civilization. That man was Aeneas, a Trojan prince, who was not a warrior of immense skill, but a man of immense piety and quiet responsibility. As the city fell, he made a choice that was not heroic, but profoundly human. He chose to save his family. He fled the burning city, not with a sword in his hand, but with his elderly father, Anchises, on his back and his young son, Ascanius, by his side. He did not fight a glorious rearguard action. He did not seek to avenge his city. He simply walked away, a fugitive with a quiet, unglamorous mission, survival. His escape was not a moment of epic heroism, but a tedious, desperate struggle through the dark, burning streets, a long, difficult journey through the night with a heavy burden on his back. The fate of Aeneas was one of a long, difficult, and profoundly boring journey to a new land. His story is not one of a hero's return, but of a refugee's long, slow search for a new home, a journey that would be filled with more quiet hardships and navigational disasters. What was the final, defining act of Aeneas's journey that led to the founding of Rome? And how did a simple act of walking away, with your family on your back, become the founding myth of an empire? Aeneas's escape from the burning city of Troy was not an act of heroism, but a simple, unglamorous, and deeply human decision. While other men fought to their deaths, or were captured, he chose a different path, one of quiet endurance. He was not a hero in the traditional sense, he was a survivor, a man burdened with the responsibility of preserving his family and his people. His journey, as foretold by the gods, was not a glorious quest but a long, tedious, and profoundly difficult search for a new home. The fate of Aeneas was to become a refugee. His story is told in Virgil's great Roman epic, the Aeneid, a poem that is a testament to the unexciting but crucial virtue of piety, or more accurately, pietas, a Roman concept that encompassed duty to the gods, to family, and to country. Aeneas's most defining action, the one that would forever be remembered as the founding myth of Rome, was not a great battle, but a simple act of walking away with his family on his back. His journey was a series of navigational failures and quiet hardships. He and his fellow Trojans, now a small, desperate fleet, sailed the Mediterranean. They were not adventurers, they were lost souls looking for a new place to call home. They were blown off course by storms, landed on hostile shores, and had to build temporary camps, only to pack up and leave again. This was the boring, day-to-day reality of a refugee crisis. They faced famine, disease, and the constant threat of attack from the peoples whose lands they encroached upon. This was the long, undramatic process of a displaced people trying to find their footing in a world that had no place for them. One of their most significant stops was in Carthage, a powerful city ruled by the beautiful and tragic Queen Dido. Aeneas and Dido fell in love, and for a time, it seemed his journey was over. He was offered a life of comfort and power, a chance to stop wandering and settle down. But this was not his destiny. The gods, in their relentless, unfeeling pursuit of their own plans, reminded him of his true mission. He was not meant to be a king of Carthage, he was meant to be the founder of a new city, a new race. His choice was a painful, but ultimately simple one. He had to leave Dido and her city behind, a decision that led to her tragic suicide and a curse that would forever pit the future Romans against the Carthaginians. This was not a moment of dramatic heroism, but one of quiet, heartbreaking duty. The final, defining act of Aeneas's journey came after a long and difficult voyage to the shores of Italy. He was not met with a hero's welcome. He was met with suspicion and hostility. The native people, the Latins, were not keen on having a group of armed, weary foreigners settling in their lands. The ensuing conflict was not a glorious war of conquest, but a series of skirmishes and battles, a protracted and undramatic struggle for land. Aeneas, ever the man of peace, tried to negotiate, to find a way to coexist. He married the king's daughter, Lavinia, a political marriage that was meant to unite the two peoples. But this did not stop the fighting. The true founding of Rome was not a moment of glory, but a long, tedious, and often brutal process of integration, assimilation, and compromise. The Trojan refugees, the Latins, and other tribes would eventually come together to form a new people. The story of Aeneas is a myth of quiet beginnings, of a man who chose family over fame, duty over desire, and survival over vengeance. He was a man who did not seek glory, but was instead chosen by fate to carry the burden of a new civilization on his weary shoulders. The legacy of Aeneas, the quiet founder of Rome, is a reflection of the Roman character itself, pragmatic, dutiful, and profoundly resilient. They were not a people of wild imagination or fleeting passion. They were a people who built roads, organized armies, and created a legal system that would last for centuries. Their founding myth, a quiet tale of a refugee carrying his family from the ashes of their home, is a testament to the fact that the greatest empires are often built not on the bones of heroes, but on the quiet, unglamorous endurance of ordinary people. The story of Aeneas teaches us that the greatest victories are often not won with a sword, but with the simple, unyielding force of a person who just keeps walking, one step at a time. We've heard the stories of great heroes consulting the oracle of Delphi, of kings seeking wisdom before battle, and of cities finding guidance in times of crisis. But the reality of visiting the oracle was far less dramatic and far more mundane. The oracle was not a lightning strike of divine inspiration, it was a quiet, tedious, and often confusing process, a bureaucratic system for divine communication. The Oracle of Delphi was the most important religious site in the Greek world, and its central figure was the Pythia, a priestess chosen from the local women of Delphi. She was not a young, beautiful virgin, as some myths suggest. She was an older woman, a person of great respect and sober habits. Her life was not one of fame or glamour, but one of quiet, almost boring, devotion to her sacred duty. She lived a simple life, a life of ritual and silence, and her only job was to be a vessel for the god Apollo. The position was not a celebrity role, it was a job, a life of quiet servitude to a god. The process of consulting the oracle was a long, undramatic affair. You couldn't just walk in and ask a question. First, you had to travel to Delphi, a journey that could take weeks or even months. The path to the temple was not a straight, easy one. It was a long, winding road through the mountains, a physical and psychological pilgrimage that was meant to humble you before you even arrived. The journey itself was a test of your resolve. Once you arrived, you had to pay a fee, a boring but essential detail of religious life in ancient Greece. The fee was called a polanos, a kind of ritual cake that was given to the priests. The size of the cake depended on the importance of the question and the wealth of the person asking. This was not a spiritual transaction, it was a financial one. The oracle, for all its divinity, was a well-funded institution, and its priests were businessmen as much as they were holy men. After paying, you had to wait. The oracle was not open every day. It was only open on the 7th day of the month, for 9 months of the year, a schedule that was rigid and unchangeable. You might arrive in Delphi and have to wait for weeks, or even months, for your turn. The wait was a tedious, soul-crushing part of the process. You would spend your days with other supplicants, all of you waiting for your moment with the god, all of you filled with a quiet sense of anxiety. The order of who was allowed to consult the oracle was a matter of social standing. The people of Delphi were first, a privilege given to them for hosting the sacred site. Then came the wealthy and powerful, the kings and generals who had paid a higher fee. Finally, if there was time, the common man would be allowed to ask a question. This was a system of divine communication that was run on a first-come, first-served basis, with a clear hierarchy based on wealth and power. When your time finally came, you were led to the temple, a place of immense history and ritual, but also a place of immense boredom. You would not be allowed to speak directly to the Pythia. Instead, you would give your question to a priest, a quiet, undramatic man who would then write it down on a tablet. The priest would then take your question and go into the adaton, the inner sanctum of the temple, where the Pythia was waiting. The question was often a simple one: should I go to war? Will I be successful? Should I marry? But the answer was never simple. The Pythia would then go through a series of rituals. She would sit on a tripod over a chasm in the earth. The chasm was said to emit a sweet-smelling gas, a kind of divine vapor that would put her in a trance-like state. This was not a grand vision, it was a simple, chemical process. The priests would then ask her the question, and she would respond in a series of disjointed, almost incoherent, phrases. Her words were not a clear, concise prophecy, but a jumble of sounds and sentences. She was a vessel, and her message was garbled. This is where the real work began, not for the Pythia, but for the priests. Their job was to interpret her rambling words and turn them into a coherent, and often ambiguous, prophecy. This was a tedious, undramatic task of translation. They were not prophets, they were interpreters, men who took a jumble of sounds and turned it into a message that could be delivered to the person waiting outside. The prophecy was often so vague that it could be interpreted in many different ways, a genius piece of political and religious maneuvering that ensured the priests were almost always right, no matter what happened. What were some of the most famous, but deliberately ambiguous, prophecies that came from the oracle? And how did this boring ambiguity become a source of immense power for the oracle and a source of immense confusion for the people who sought its guidance? The true power of the oracle of Delphi lay not in the clarity of its prophecies, but in their deliberate, frustrating ambiguity. The priests, as the intermediaries between the garbled utterances of the Pythia and the anxious questions of the supplicants, were masters of this art. Their job was to craft a prophecy that was so vague, so open to interpretation, that no matter what happened in the future, the oracle would appear to have been right all along. This boring, almost bureaucratic process of linguistic manipulation was a cornerstone of its immense influence. One of the most famous examples of this is the story of King Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was a man of immense wealth, so much so that he is the source of the saying, "as rich as Croesus." He was faced with a monumental decision: should he go to war with the mighty Persian Empire? A question of immense importance, to which a direct, clear answer was needed. He sent messengers to Delphi with an enormous offering of gold and silver, a bribe to ensure a favorable answer. The priests, in their wisdom, knew better than to give him a simple yes or no. The prophecy he received was as follows: if you cross the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus, being a man of immense pride and confidence, interpreted this exactly as he wanted to hear it. He believed the prophecy meant that he would be the one to destroy the great Persian Empire. He went to war. He crossed the Halys River, and he was, in fact, defeated. His own Lydian Empire, one of the greatest of its time, was utterly destroyed. When he was captured by the Persian king, he sent a bitter message to Delphi, asking the priests how they could have been so wrong. The priests, in a perfect display of their craft, calmly explained that they had been right all along. A great empire had indeed been destroyed, it just happened to be his. The boring ambiguity of the prophecy was its strength. It was a tool that could be used to explain any outcome, a kind of cosmic, heads, you lose, tails, you lose, scenario. The oracle never took a side, it simply offered a truth that was so broad that it could encompass any eventuality. This allowed the priests to maintain a perfect record of being right, even in the face of colossal failures. It also meant that the person who received the prophecy was forced to take responsibility for their own actions. The oracle had simply given them a truth, it was up to them to interpret it and act upon it. Another famous example is the prophecy given to the Athenians during the invasion of the Persian army under Xerxes. The Athenians, in a state of panic, sent messengers to Delphi to ask for a way to save their city. The prophecy they received was a grim one: only the wooden wall will not fall. The citizens of Athens, in their desperation, were divided. Some believed the prophecy meant they should fortify the Acropolis with a wooden fence. Others, more pragmatic, argued that the prophecy was a sign that they should abandon the city and fight at sea. Themistocles, a brilliant Athenian general, argued for the second interpretation. He said that the wooden wall was a reference to their ships, their navy. He was a man of logic, and he chose to believe in a boring, tactical interpretation of the prophecy rather than a grand, symbolic one. The Athenians listened to him, and they abandoned their city. The Persians came, and they burned the Acropolis, destroying the city. But the Athenians, on their ships, lured the Persian navy into the narrow Strait of Salamis and, in a brilliant naval victory, destroyed them. The oracle was right. The wooden wall, the ships, had not fallen. The city had. The prophecy was, once again, a perfect example of ambiguity. It told them what would not fall, but it did not tell them what would be saved. It was a partial truth that was only made whole by the intelligent, and very unmythological, actions of a single man. The oracle was not just a source of prophecy, it was a source of immense political power. Kings and generals would visit the site to give their decisions a divine authority. If they were planning a war, they would get a prophecy that could be interpreted as a divine sanction for their actions. If they were planning a new law, they would claim that it was guided by the god Apollo. The oracle provided a kind of mythological rubber stamp for the boring, practical decisions of everyday life. It was a way to justify your actions, to give them a sense of divine purpose, even when they were rooted in simple political and economic realities. The life of a Pythia, of a priestess, was one of profound, almost total, silence. Her words, so important to the Greeks, were not her own. They were the words of a god, garbled and difficult, and she was just a vessel. Her life was a quiet, undramatic one, a life of ritual and duty, of sitting on a tripod and uttering unintelligible phrases. Her power was immense, but it was not her own. It belonged to the priests, to the institution, and to the power of a single, ambiguous sentence. What was the final, undramatic end of the Oracle of Delphi? And how did a place of immense power and influence slowly fade into a boring, historical footnote? The immense power of the Oracle of Delphi was not brought down by a great battle or a monumental historical event. Its decline was a slow, quiet, and profoundly boring process of irrelevance. The oracle, which had for centuries been the spiritual and political heart of the Greek world, simply faded away as the world around it changed. The first major blow to the oracle's authority came with the rise of the Roman Empire. The Romans were, by nature, a pragmatic and legalistic people. They had their own system of divination, but their religious life was less about the ambiguous guidance of a priestess and more about the strict observance of rituals and omens. They were more interested in the mundane flight of birds or the reading of entrails than the cryptic utterances of a trance-saddled priestess. The oracle's deliberate ambiguity, which had been its strength in the Greek world, was seen as a weakness by the Romans, who preferred clear-cut answers to their political and military questions. The oracle was still consulted, but it was no longer the primary source of divine guidance for the most powerful empire in the world. The real death knell of the oracle, however, came with the rise of a new religion, Christianity. Christianity, with its single, all-knowing God and its reliance on a holy book, had no need for a fallible, human oracle. The Christian faith was a direct line to God, a personal relationship that rendered the need for an intermediary like the Pythia completely obsolete. The oracle was seen as a relic of a pagan, unholy past, and its prophecies were dismissed as the work of the devil or the product of a simple gas. The Emperor Theodosius I, in his campaign to suppress paganism, officially ordered the closing of all pagan temples, including the Oracle of Delphi, in 392 AD. The closure was not a dramatic siege or a violent act of destruction. It was a simple, boring edict, a bureaucratic decree that ended a millennium of religious life. The final end of the oracle was undramatic and sad. The temple and its surrounding buildings were no longer maintained. They fell into disrepair, and the site was gradually reclaimed by nature. The once bustling pilgrimage site became a quiet, forgotten place, its ancient history buried under layers of dust and time. It was eventually rediscovered in the 19th century by archaeologists who found the ruins of the temple and the treasury, a testament to the immense wealth and power that had once been concentrated there. But they found no prophecies, no magic, just the boring, historical reality of a once great institution that had been rendered obsolete by the slow, grinding forces of history. The legacy of the Oracle of Delphi is not a grand, heroic one. It is a quiet, profound lesson in the nature of power and the inevitability of change. The oracle's power was not rooted in divine magic, but in the mundane mechanics of human psychology, politics, and ambiguity. It was a perfect example of a system that worked for its time, a system that allowed humans to make sense of a confusing, unpredictable world. But as the world changed, as new ideas and new religions took hold, the system became obsolete. The story of the oracle teaches us that even the most powerful and seemingly eternal institutions are not immune to the slow, unglamorous march of history. Its demise was not a moment of great drama, but a quiet, almost unobserved decline. The Oracle of Delphi, the once unquestioned center of the Greek world, is a powerful reminder that even the grandest and most epic stories often have a quiet, boring, and profoundly human ending. You know the name Heracles, the mightiest of all Greek heroes, a figure of immense strength, and the star of a dozen epic tales. But what if we told you that his most famous feats, his legendary 12 labors, were not acts of pure, unbridled heroism? What if they were, in reality, a series of tedious, soul-crushing chores, a form of ancient community service with a mythological twist? Forget the glory for a moment. Instead, let's focus on the unglamorous, logistical, and profoundly boring details of a demigod's to-do list. The story begins not with a monster, but with a family tragedy. Heracles, in a fit of temporary madness sent by the ever-vengeful Hera, killed his own wife and children. When he came to his senses and realized what he had done, he was filled with immense grief and shame. He sought a way to atone for his terrible crime. He consulted the Oracle of Delphi, which, as we know, was a master of subtle, unhelpful advice. The oracle, prompted by Hera, told him that he must submit himself to his cousin, King Eurystheus of Tiryns, and perform a series of labors for him. This was a profoundly unheroic command. Heracles, a man of immense power, was being told to become a servant, a tool in the hands of a weak and cowardly man. Eurystheus, who was terrified of Heracles' strength, was a petty tyrant. He didn't want Heracles to do great deeds, he wanted to humiliate him. The labors were not a path to glory, they were a path to servitude, a punishment designed to be as tedious and as difficult as possible. The first labor was to kill the Nemean lion. Now, you might think of this as a simple monster-slaying task, a quick and glorious battle. But the reality was far more mundane. The lion's hide was impenetrable to bronze, a fact Heracles discovered after his sword and arrows simply bounced off its skin. The solution, therefore, was not a matter of strength, but of strategy and immense physical exertion. Heracles had to track the beast for days, a boring, unglamorous task of stalking through the wilderness. He then had to corner the lion in its cave, which had two entrances. He blocked one with a giant boulder, a backbreaking piece of manual labor, and then, he had to fight the lion with his bare hands. He didn't use a sword, he used his own raw strength, a quiet, brutal, and profoundly exhausting act of wrestling. The legend says he strangled the beast, a testament to his immense power, but also to the fact that his greatest victories were not won with a weapon, but with sheer, unglamorous persistence. The second labor was to kill the Lernaean Hydra. Again, this sounds like a great monster-slaying myth. But the reality was a logistical nightmare. The Hydra was a multi-headed serpent that grew 2 new heads for every one that was cut off. This was not a fight that could be won with a single strike. It was a problem that required a more complex, and boringly technical, solution. Heracles enlisted the help of his nephew, Iolaus. The plan was simple. Heracles would use his club to smash each head, and Iolaus would use a torch to cauterize the stump, preventing new heads from growing. The battle, therefore, was not a glorious clash of heroes and monsters, but a coordinated, 2-man team working together in a quiet, methodical way. It was a kind of ancient plumbing job, a gruesome bit of repetitive manual labor. The next labor was to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer with golden horns. This sounds like an easy task, but it was not. Heracles was not allowed to harm the animal, as it was sacred to the goddess Artemis. The task, therefore, was not a hunt, but a chase, a long, tedious, and immensely frustrating pursuit. Heracles tracked the deer for an entire year, a soul-crushing journey that took him from Greece to the far north and back again. He didn't win by force, he won by patience and immense endurance. It was a victory of sheer, unglamorous persistence. And so, the labors continued. Each one was a test, not of Heracles' strength, but of his endurance, his intelligence, and his ability to handle a series of boring, tedious, and often disgusting tasks. They were a form of ancient community service, a quiet penance for a great crime. What was the most disgusting and unheroic of all the labors, and how did a simple, unglamorous act of construction allow Heracles to complete it? The most disgusting and unheroic of all the labors of Heracles was the cleaning of the Augean stables. This was not a fight with a monster or a chase after a mystical creature, it was a simple, soul-crushing chore, a task so menial and revolting that it was the perfect test of Heracles' character. King Eurystheus, in his petty cruelty, assigned this labor, knowing full well that no mortal could complete it. The stables belonged to King Augeas, who owned a herd of 3,000 cattle, and the stables had not been cleaned in over 30 years. The accumulation of filth was immense and overwhelming, a profound symbol of neglect and decay. The problem with the Augean stables was not one of strength, but of sheer, unheroic scale. Heracles couldn't simply shovel the waste out. The sheer volume of it was unimaginable. It would have taken him years, a lifetime of backbreaking, filthy labor, and that was the point of the task. Eurystheus wanted to humiliate him, to prove that even a demigod could be defeated by a simple, overwhelming chore. But Heracles, ever the problem solver, knew that he could not win this by brute force. He had to use his mind, not just his muscles. His solution was a testament to his practical, unglamorous genius. He did not go in with a shovel. Instead, he approached the problem like a civil engineer. He found the two nearest rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, and he studied their flow. He then set to the boring, backbreaking task of digging a series of channels and ditches. He redirected the rivers, a simple, yet monumental act of boring manual labor. He didn't build a dam, he simply changed the course of the rivers, a quiet, undramatic act of water management. The rushing water of the rivers then flowed directly into the stables, a powerful, and very fast, kind of natural pressure washer. The water rushed through the stables, carrying all the filth, all the muck, and all the waste away with it, leaving the stables completely clean. The entire process was finished in a single day. This was not a victory of strength, but a victory of ingenuity. It was a perfect example of a hero who understood that the most difficult problems are often solved not with a sword, but with a simple, unglamorous act of engineering. He had defeated the problem not by fighting it, but by outthinking it. But his victory was a hollow one. King Eurystheus refused to pay him for his work, claiming that Heracles had cheated by using the rivers and not his own brute strength. The entire labor, in the eyes of the king, was null and void. The king's petty jealousy and refusal to acknowledge Heracles' genius was a final, unheroic slap in the face. The remaining labors continued this trend of boring, methodical problem-solving. To get the golden apples of the Hesperides, a task that was believed to be impossible, Heracles did not fight his way to the garden. Instead, he found the Titan Atlas, who was holding up the sky, and offered to take his burden for a short time in exchange for the apples. Atlas, who was tired of his endless punishment, agreed. He went and got the apples while Heracles, in a moment of immense, soul-crushing exertion, held the entire sky on his shoulders. This was a purely physical and undramatic act, a simple exchange of one burden for another. When Atlas returned, he tried to trick Heracles into keeping the sky, but Heracles, with his usual cunning, tricked him back. He was a hero who won not by fighting, but by a series of clever, almost tedious, manipulations. The final labor was to capture Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the entrance to the underworld. This was a task that no mortal was meant to complete. Heracles did not fight his way into the underworld. Instead, he sought permission from the gods Hades and Persephone. They agreed to let him take the dog, on one simple, unheroic condition: he had to capture Cerberus without using any weapons. He had to use his own brute strength, a final, physical act of pure, unglamorous wrestling. The labors of Heracles were not a testament to his strength, but a testament to his immense endurance and his ability to handle a series of tedious, disgusting, and often humiliating tasks. They were a path to redemption, a long and difficult journey that was not marked by glorious victories, but by a series of quiet, and often boring, acts of survival. What was the final, unheroic fate of Heracles? And how did a life of grand, epic deeds end in a quiet, painful, and profoundly human way? The final, unheroic fate of Heracles was not a glorious battle against a fearsome monster or a grand confrontation with a jealous god. His life, which had been a series of immense physical trials and tedious chores, ended in a quiet, agonizing, and profoundly human way. It was a death born not of a cosmic struggle, but of a simple, mundane act of love and jealousy. After his labors were complete, Heracles was finally free. But the curse of Hera, a quiet, persistent malevolence, was not yet finished with him. He had married a woman named Diana, who was not a goddess or a princess of great renown, but a simple, loving, and profoundly human woman. Her story is a quiet tragedy that would bring the mighty hero to his knees. She was once rescued by Heracles from a centaur named Nessus. The centaur, in a moment of vengeful cunning, told Diana that if she ever feared Heracles' love was wavering, she could use his blood, which he claimed was a love potion, to win him back. It was a quiet, undramatic trick, a simple piece of mythological deceit. Many years later, Heracles, now a man of immense fame and immense weariness, fell in love with a younger woman. Diana, fearing she would lose her husband, remembered the centaur's words. In a moment of simple, human desperation, she soaked a tunic in the centaur's blood and sent it to Heracles, believing it would rekindle his love. But the blood was not a love potion, it was a powerful, corrosive poison. The centaur, in his last moments of life, had wanted to take his revenge on the man who had defeated him, and he did so in a quiet, insidious way. When Heracles put on the tunic, the poison, a chemical agent that was corrosive to his divine and mortal flesh, began to burn him. This was not a quick, glorious death. It was a slow, agonizing process. The poison seeped into his skin, clinging to his flesh, burning him from the inside out. He tried to tear the tunic off, but it was stuck to his skin, and as he pulled, he tore off his own flesh. This was the true, unheroic end of the greatest of all heroes, a death of slow, painful, and profoundly undramatic suffering. He was not killed by a monster, he was killed by a simple act of human desperation and a piece of quiet, unheroic deception. In a final, painful act, he asked to be laid on a pyre and burned, a final release from his agony. His mortal body was consumed by the flames, but his immortal soul, his divine essence, was finally freed from his mortal coil. He was then taken to Olympus, where he was welcomed as a god. The life of Heracles, the great hero, was not a series of epic battles. It was a series of tedious, disgusting, and often humiliating tasks. His greatest victories were won not with a sword, but with a clever mind, immense patience, and the ability to endure. His final act was not one of glory, but of a slow, painful, and unglamorous death. This is the true legacy of Heracles. He was a hero who won not by being the strongest, but by being the most resilient. His story teaches us that the greatest test of a person's character is not in their ability to perform grand, heroic acts, but in their ability to handle a series of boring, tedious, and profoundly unheroic chores. His life was a testament to the fact that even the greatest and most glorious stories often have a quiet, painful, and profoundly human ending. We often think of the myths as stories of heroes and gods, of grand battles and epic quests. But some of the most enduring stories are about the quiet, unheroic punishments for simple, undramatic crimes. Our next subject is Sisyphus, a man whose name has become synonymous with a task that is both impossible and profoundly boring. His myth is not about a great sin, but about a series of small, mundane misdeeds that led to a punishment of immense and soul-crushing tedium. Sisyphus was the king of Ephyra, later known as Corinth. He was not a great warrior or a demigod of immense power. He was a man of cunning, a shrewd ruler who was more interested in wealth and power than in honor or glory. His greatest talent was not his strength, but his ability to deceive. He was a liar, a schemer, and a man who would do whatever it took to get what he wanted. His crimes were not grand acts of rebellion against the gods, but a series of small, petty transgressions that earned him their quiet, and ultimately devastating, anger. His first major offense was a violation of the most sacred law of the ancient world, the law of hospitality. Sisyphus, in his greed, would kill his guests, a terrible sin that was a direct affront to Zeus, the god of hospitality. He did this not out of a fit of rage, but out of a cold, calculated desire for their wealth. This was not a crime of passion, it was a crime of pure, unglamorous greed. But his most famous act of cunning was his ability to outsmart Thanatos, the god of death. Sisyphus, a man who loved life and had no intention of leaving it, learned that Thanatos was coming for him. In a quiet, undramatic act of deception, he convinced Thanatos to show him the shackles he used to bind the souls of the dead. When Thanatos, in a moment of hubris, showed him the shackles, Sisyphus, in a simple and clever move, used them to bind Thanatos himself. Death was now chained and helpless. This was not a glorious battle. It was a simple, boring trick. But the consequences were immense. With Thanatos chained, no one could die. The world was thrown into a state of chaos. People were suffering from fatal wounds, but they couldn't die. This wasn't a world of happy immortality, it was a world of endless, agonizing suffering. The gods, in their immense power, had to act. Ares, the god of war, was particularly displeased. His battles had no meaning if no one could be killed. He went to the house of Sisyphus, freed Thanatos, and handed Sisyphus over to him. Sisyphus, now in the clutches of death, had one last trick up his sleeve. Before he was taken, he had quietly instructed his wife not to perform the traditional burial rites for him. He was a man who planned for every contingency, a man who saw death not as a finality, but as a problem to be solved. When he arrived in the underworld, he complained to Hades, the king of the dead, that he had been denied a proper burial. He argued that it was a terrible injustice, and that he should be allowed to return to the world of the living for a short time to arrange for his own burial. Hades, who was a stickler for the rules, agreed. This was a simple, bureaucratic victory, a win born not of a grand plan, but of a quiet, undramatic legal argument. Sisyphus was granted a temporary reprieve, a chance to go back to the land of the living. But once he was back, he had no intention of returning. He lived for many more years, a fugitive from death, until finally, he was recaptured and taken back to the underworld for good. This time, there would be no escape. The gods, who had been outsmarted twice by a simple mortal, were furious. His punishment would not be a quick, violent one. It would be a slow, persistent, and profoundly undramatic one. It would be a punishment that was both physically and psychologically exhausting, a task that was designed to be both endless and utterly pointless. What was the quiet, unheroic punishment of Sisyphus? And how did a simple, undramatic act of rolling a stone become a profound symbol of the human condition? The punishment of Sisyphus was not one of fire or brimstone, but of pure, unadulterated tedium. The gods, in their infinite wisdom and their profound understanding of the human spirit, knew that the greatest punishment was not physical pain, but the psychological agony of endless, pointless effort. They sentenced him to the underworld, where he was tasked with rolling a massive stone up a steep hill. The stone was immense and unwieldy, a dead weight that required all of his strength to move. He would strain and push, his muscles screaming, his body aching, as he inched the boulder up the slope. This was not a glorious battle, but a grueling, repetitive chore. The task was boring, a slow and methodical act of physical exertion. He had no one to help him, no one to cheer him on. It was just him, the stone, and the silent, unyielding mountain. The monotony of the task must have been soul-crushing. Day after day, hour after hour, he would push the same stone up the same hill, a prisoner of a single, repetitive action. His life was reduced to a single, undramatic cycle of effort and failure. The most profound and agonizing part of the punishment was the moment just before the end. Just as he was about to reach the summit, just as he could feel the promise of a completed task, the stone, in its own silent, unyielding way, would roll back down, undoing all of his hard work in a single, frustrating moment. This was the true cruelty of the punishment. It offered him a glimpse of hope, a moment of almost victory, only to snatch it away. It was a punishment that preyed on the most human of all desires, the desire to finish what you started. The sight of the stone rolling back down the hill must have been a form of psychological torture. All of his effort, all of his pain, all of his suffering, was for nothing. He was a prisoner of a single, undramatic, and profoundly absurd task. The hill was not a glorious battlefield, it was a symbol of his futility. The stone was not a magical object, it was a simple, boring weight, a constant reminder of his unheroic fate. But Sisyphus, the cunning and stubborn king, was a man who did not give up easily. He would descend the mountain, his body aching, his spirit broken, and he would begin again. This was not a moment of heroism, but a moment of sheer, unglamorous persistence. He was a man who, even in the face of an impossible task, just kept going. He was a survivor, a man who, even in the face of an impossible punishment, refused to be broken. The punishment of Sisyphus is a profound metaphor for the human condition. It is a story about the absurdity of our own struggles, the futility of our own efforts, and the quiet, undramatic courage it takes to just keep going. His punishment was not a punishment of physical pain, but a punishment of psychological torment, a silent, boring, and eternal lesson in the nature of life itself. We are all Sisyphus, pushing our own stones up our own hills, and in the end, it is not the victory that matters, but the quiet, unyielding act of pushing. What was the final, undramatic philosophical conclusion about Sisyphus's fate? And how did a simple, undramatic act of rolling a stone become a profound symbol of the human condition and the triumph of the human spirit? The final, undramatic philosophical conclusion about Sisyphus's fate was not a moment of divine forgiveness or a magical escape. It was a quiet, profound realization about the nature of his punishment and, by extension, the nature of human life itself. The philosopher Albert Camus, in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, reinterpreted the myth not as a tragedy, but as a triumph of the human spirit. He argued that the true horror of the punishment wasn't the physical labor, but the psychological torment of a task that was both endless and pointless. But for Camus, this was also where Sisyphus found his freedom. He argued that Sisyphus is the absurd hero because he is fully conscious of the futility of his task. He is a man who knows that his efforts are for nothing, that the stone will always roll back down the hill, and that his punishment is eternal. But in that very moment of lucidity, in the moment he accepts his fate without despair, he becomes free. He is no longer a slave to the God's will, he is a man who has chosen to embrace his own destiny. The true victory of Sisyphus is not in the glorious act of reaching the summit, but in the quiet, undramatic act of walking back down the hill. This descent is the moment of consciousness, the moment of reflection. He is a man who is greater than his fate, and his contempt for it, his quiet and defiant acceptance of it, is what makes him a hero. He finds meaning not in the completion of the task, but in the act of doing it. The struggle itself is enough to fill a man's heart. The myth of Sisyphus, therefore, is not a story of defeat, but of quiet, unglamorous victory. It is a testament to the fact that even in the face of the most absurd and meaningless tasks, a human can find dignity, purpose, and a kind of profound, spiritual triumph. His punishment was not a punishment of fire and brimstone, it was a quiet, undramatic, an eternal lesson in the nature of life itself. We are all Sisyphus, pushing our own stones up our own hills, and in the end, it is not the victory that matters, but the quiet, unyielding act of pushing. The myth teaches us that even in the most boring and frustrating of circumstances, the human spirit can find a way to be free. We often speak of destiny as if it were a grand, sweeping concept, a dramatic narrative written by a celestial hand. But in Greek myth, destiny was a quiet, undramatic, and profoundly boring process. It was not a cosmic decree written in the stars, but a series of slow, tedious, and meticulous actions performed by three goddesses, the Fates. They were not figures of great drama or immense power in the traditional sense. They were weavers, spinners, and cutters, a trio of old women performing a mundane, repetitive task that shaped the entire universe. The Fates, or the Moirai, as they were known in Greek, were a triumvirate of unglamorous power. They were older than the gods themselves, a fact that gave them an immense, quiet authority. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not defy their will. They were not to be bargained with, bribed, or reasoned with. They were a force of pure, unfeeling, and undramatic inevitability. The three sisters were named Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Their names were not grand, heroic titles, but simple descriptions of their boring, tedious tasks. Clotho was the spinner. Her job was to spin the thread of a person's life. This was a slow, methodical, and repetitive process. She would spin the thread from her distaff, a simple, unglamorous tool. The length and thickness of the thread would determine the length and quality of a person's life. A long, thick thread meant a long and prosperous life. A thin, short thread meant a life that was short and full of suffering. She was not a goddess of immense creation, she was a worker, a laborer, a quiet and undramatic spinner of thread. Lachesis was the allottor. Her job was to measure the thread. This was a task that required immense patience and precision. She would use a simple measuring stick to measure the length of a person's life, from birth to death. She was not a goddess of grand decrees, she was a bureaucrat, a cosmic administrator, a quiet and meticulous keeper of records. Her job was to ensure that a person's life was lived according to the length of the thread. She was the one who decided the mundane details of a person's life, their triumphs, their sorrows, their moments of joy, and their moments of pain. Atropos was the unturnable. Her name itself means, not to be turned, or, inevitable. Her job was the most final and the most undramatic of all. When a person's thread had reached its end, she would cut it with a simple pair of shears. This was not a moment of great drama or cosmic finality, it was a simple, unglamorous, and inevitable act. She was not a goddess of death, but a quiet, efficient administrator of it. Her job was to ensure that a person's life ended exactly when it was meant to. The Fates, in their quiet, undramatic way, controlled everything. They were the ones who decided when a person would be born, when they would die, and everything that would happen in between. Their work was not a series of grand pronouncements, it was a series of small, meticulous, and profoundly boring tasks. They were a testament to the fact that even the most grand and dramatic of lives are shaped by a series of quiet, unglamorous, and inescapable acts. The myths often tell of heroes who tried to defy the fates, to change their destiny. But these attempts were always futile. They were not fighting a powerful god or a fearsome monster, they were fighting a simple, undramatic, and unyielding piece of string. A hero's attempt to change his fate was a direct confrontation with the most boring and the most powerful force in the universe, inevitability. What was the single, undramatic event that most clearly showed the fate's unyielding power? And how did a simple, undramatic prophecy become a profound and unchangeable truth? The single, undramatic event that most clearly showed the fate's unyielding power was the prophecy given to King Laius of Thebes that he would be killed by his own son. The king's mundane, but deliberate, attempts to defy this prophecy by abandoning his newborn son, Oedipus, led directly to the very events that fulfilled it. The quiet, undramatic power of the fates was never more evident than in the story of Oedipus. The prophecy given to his father, King Laius, was not a grand, cosmic decree of a hero's fate. It was a simple, unglamorous, and deeply personal curse: you will be killed by your own son. King Laius and his wife, Jocasta, were terrified. In a desperate, and profoundly unheroic, attempt to defy their destiny, they decided to get rid of the child. They did not kill him themselves, as that would be a terrible sin. Instead, they performed a quiet, undramatic act of abandonment. They pierced his ankles with a pin, a simple and painful mutilation, and gave him to a shepherd with instructions to leave him on a remote mountain to die. This was a profoundly boring and futile act. It was a simple, human attempt to control a force that was beyond their control. They were not fighting a monster, they were fighting a piece of string. And the fates, in their quiet, undramatic way, were not to be defied. The shepherd, taking pity on the child, did not leave him to die. Instead, he gave him to a fellow shepherd, who then gave him to the king and queen of Corinth, who raised him as their own. The child, given the name Oedipus, which means swollen foot, grew up completely unaware of his true parentage and the quiet, unyielding curse that was his destiny. When Oedipus was an adult, he heard a rumor that he was not the true son of the king and queen of Corinth. He went to the oracle of Delphi to ask about his true parentage. The oracle, in its typical, infuriatingly vague fashion, did not tell him who his parents were. Instead, it gave him a new prophecy: he would kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus, in his own desperate attempt to defy his fate, fled from Corinth, believing that the king and queen of Corinth were his parents. He was running from a curse that he believed would harm the very people who had raised him. He was a man running from his destiny, a man fighting a piece of string that was already woven. His journey, however, was a long, undramatic and ultimately futile one. He was traveling on a lonely road when he came across a chariot. In a moment of a mundane, and very human, road rage, he got into a fight with the man in the chariot and, in a fit of rage, killed him. The man he had killed, in a quiet, unheroic moment on a lonely road, was his father, King Laius. The first part of the prophecy had been fulfilled, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through a simple, mundane act of violence. The second part of the prophecy was no less undramatic. He continued his journey and arrived in Thebes, a city that was being tormented by a monster, the Sphinx. The Sphinx would ask a riddle, and if a person could not answer, it would kill them. The city was in a state of quiet despair. Oedipus, in a moment of brilliance, solved the riddle. He was hailed as a hero and was offered the hand of the recently widowed queen, Jocasta. He married her, a quiet, undramatic marriage that fulfilled the second part of the prophecy. He had killed his father and married his mother, all without knowing it. He was a hero who, in his attempt to escape his destiny, had simply walked straight into it. The tragic, but profoundly boring, story of Oedipus is a perfect example of the fates' unyielding power. They did not need to be seen or heard. They simply spun the thread, and in their quiet, undramatic way, they ensured that a king's fear and a hero's attempt to escape their fate would only lead them directly to it. The fates are a perfect example of the unglamorous, undramatic, and inescapable forces that shape our lives. What was the final, undramatic conclusion of the story of Oedipus? And how did a simple, undramatic series of revelations lead to the destruction of a royal family and a profound understanding of the fates' power? The final, undramatic conclusion of the story of Oedipus was not a climactic battle, but a series of quiet, devastating revelations. A plague fell upon the city of Thebes, and in their desperation, the people sought a cure from the gods. The oracle of Delphi, in its typically unhelpful way, said the plague would only end when the murderer of King Laius was found and punished. Oedipus, ever the good king, vowed to find the killer. In his search, he began to ask quiet, undramatic questions, and as he did, the truth, in its own methodical and unglamorous way, began to unravel. The search for the killer of King Laius was a slow, meticulous, and profoundly undramatic investigation. Oedipus, in his quest for justice, questioned everyone he could find. He spoke to the blind prophet, Tiresias, who, in his cryptic way, told Oedipus that he was the killer. Oedipus, in his pride, dismissed the prophet as a madman. He then spoke to his wife, Jocasta, who, in her attempts to comfort him, told him the story of how her former husband, Laius, had been killed at a place where three roads meet. This was a quiet, undramatic detail, but for Oedipus, it was a moment of profound, soul-crushing recognition. The place where three roads meet was the very place where he had killed a man in a fit of rage. As the truth began to unravel, Jocasta, in her quiet, undramatic way, realized the full horror of their situation. She, who had tried to outsmart the fates by abandoning her child, had now married him. She went to her chambers and, in a final, quiet act of despair, hanged herself. When Oedipus, who had finally put all the pieces together, found her, he took the golden brooches from her robes and, in a final, unheroic act of self-punishment, blinded himself. He had seen the truth, and it was a truth so horrible that he could not bear to look upon the world again. The story of Oedipus is a testament to the unyielding power of the fates. They were not to be bargained with or defied. They were a force of pure, undramatic inevitability. The tragedy was not in Oedipus's fate, but in his futile attempts to escape it. His life was a testament to the fact that you cannot run from your destiny, that every step you take to avoid it only brings you closer to it. The fates did not need to be seen or heard. They simply spun the thread, and in their quiet, undramatic way, they ensured that a king's fear and a hero's attempt to escape their fate would only lead them directly to it. The legacy of the fates is a quiet, profound lesson in the nature of human freedom and the illusion of control. We often believe we are in charge of our own lives, that our decisions and our actions are our own. But the myth of the fates suggests otherwise. It suggests that there are forces, quiet and undramatic, that are shaping our lives, and that our greatest power is not in our ability to change our destiny, but in our ability to accept it with grace and courage. The fates are a perfect example of the unglamorous, undramatic, and inescapable forces that shape our lives. When you hear the story of Jason and the Argonauts, you probably think of a grand, epic quest for a magical object. You might imagine a dashing hero, a crew of brave adventurers, and a series of dramatic, heroic confrontations. But the reality of the quest for the Golden Fleece was far less glamorous and far more tedious. It was a journey of immense logistical challenges, a series of unheroic chores, and a testament to the sheer boredom of a long, difficult sea voyage. The story begins with a simple, undramatic act of usurpation. Jason, the rightful heir to the throne of Iolcus, had been overthrown by his wicked uncle, Peleus. Peleus, a man who was terrified of a prophecy that a man with one sandal would be his downfall, saw Jason, who had lost a sandal helping an old woman cross a river, as a threat. Peleus, in his cunning, did not kill Jason. Instead, he gave him a seemingly impossible task: retrieve the golden fleece from the distant land of Colchis. This was not a test of strength, but a challenge of endurance, a quest that was designed to be long, difficult, and, hopefully, fatal. Jason, however, was a man who understood the value of a team. He knew he could not complete this task alone. His first and most boring challenge was to assemble a crew. This was not a glamorous process of recruiting heroes, it was a tedious, unglamorous task of finding skilled sailors, warriors, and navigators. The list of the Argonauts is a long, boring list of names, a testament to the fact that a great quest requires a large, and often undramatic, group of people. He had to find a helmsman, a cook, a carpenter, and a man who could tell a good story. This was a process of human resource management, not of heroic recruitment. The most famous of his crew was Heracles, the very hero who had just completed his 12 labors. He was not there for glory. He was there as a favor to a friend, a man who, like Jason, understood the value of a long, difficult task. Heracles was a symbol of strength and power, but on the Argo, he was just another sailor, another man who had to row, to eat a sailor's unglamorous food, and to endure the quiet monotony of a sea voyage. The ship itself, the Argo, was not a vessel of immense magical power. It was a ship built by a master craftsman, Argus, a different Argus from the hundred-eyed one, and it was a marvel of mundane engineering. It was built with a single piece of talking wood from the sacred grove of Dodona, a small, undramatic piece of magic that gave the ship a kind of quiet sentience. But for the most part, the ship was a simple, wooden vessel, a home for 50 men who were all crammed together in a small, uncomfortable space. The day-to-day reality of life on the Argo was one of immense boredom. The men had to row for hours, a repetitive, physically exhausting task that required no skill, just immense endurance. They had to eat the same boring food, and they had to sleep in the same cramped quarters. The journey itself was a series of boring, unglamorous, and often frustrating logistical problems. Their first stop was the island of Lemnos, a land populated entirely by women who had killed their husbands. The encounter was not a dramatic one. The women, in their desire for companionship, simply invited the men to stay, and the men, in their desire for a respite from their tedious journey, agreed. They stayed for a year, a long, boring delay that was not part of their plan. This was not a moment of heroism, but a moment of simple, unglamorous temptation. Their next major stop was the land of the Dolions, a friendly people who welcomed them. But in a moment of a mundane, and very human, navigational error, the ship was blown back to the island in the dark. The Dolions, thinking they were being invaded by a hostile force, attacked them, and in a terrible, quiet, and unheroic battle, many of the Dolions were killed. This was not a fight with a monster, it was a fight born of a simple, unglamorous mistake, a testament to the fact that even the most heroic of journeys can be derailed by a single moment of human fallibility. And so, the journey continued, a long, tedious, and profoundly unheroic series of stops and starts. The Argonauts were not fighting monsters every day, they were fighting boredom, frustration, and the sheer, physical exhaustion of a long sea voyage. The quest for the Golden Fleece was not a grand adventure, it was a testament to the sheer, unglamorous power of endurance. What was the most unheroic and mundane test Jason faced in his quest? And how did a simple, undramatic act of farming become the most difficult part of his quest? The most unheroic and mundane test Jason faced in his quest was the plowing of a field with fire-breathing oxen. This simple, undramatic act of farming became the most difficult part of his quest because it required him to face a series of monotonous, repetitive, and profoundly dangerous chores, not with a sword, but with a simple plow. After a long and arduous journey, the Argonauts finally arrived in the land of Colchis, ruled by the powerful and cunning King Aeetes. Jason, with the Golden Fleece now in sight, went to the king and asked for it. King Aeetes, however, was not about to simply hand over his treasure. He gave Jason a series of tasks, a series of trials that were designed to be both impossible and profoundly unheroic. The first and most unglamorous of these tasks was to yoke 2 fire-breathing oxen to a plow and plow a field. The oxen were not just monsters, they were a problem of immense logistical and physical proportions. Their breath was fire, and their hooves were made of bronze. This was not a task for a hero, it was a task for a farmer, a man who understood the mundane, boring details of agriculture. Jason, in his attempt to complete this task, was not fighting a monster, he was fighting a problem of immense heat and immense weight. Jason, however, had an ally in the king's daughter, Medea. She was a powerful sorceress who had fallen in love with him. She gave him a magic ointment that would protect him from the heat of the oxen's breath and a potion that would calm the beasts. This was a profoundly unheroic moment. Jason did not win by his own strength or cunning, he won by the quiet, undramatic, and very useful magic of a woman who loved him. He smeared the ointment on his body, a simple, unglamorous act, and then he went into the field. The oxen were immense and terrifying, their breath a constant, searing heat. Jason, however, with the help of the ointment, was able to subdue them. He yoked them to the plow, a backbreaking and difficult task, and then he began to plow the field. This was not a glorious battle, it was a long, tedious, and profoundly undramatic act of farming. He was not a warrior, he was a laborer, a man with a plow, a testament to the fact that even the greatest of quests can be a series of boring chores.